Hi, everybody. Welcome to La Lista, a LatinX writers podcast. This is your host, Ruben Mendive, and I have a whole brand new guest here for us, joining us in studio. So I always ask my guests to introduce themselves, their names, how they identify, and just a little snippet for the audience at home.
Hi, I'm Aaron Serna. I'm from South Texas, border town, born and raised in McAllen, Texas. I identify as Chicano. I've got some indigenous Mexican blood with a little bit of Spanish and Portuguese for good measure, but I identify as Chicano.
So you already mentioned this a little bit, but the second question I always ask everybody is, where are you from? So tell me your story about you, your family, where are you guys from?
Yeah, so I grew up in McAllen, which is a town that is kind of all over the papers right now just because of the humanitarian crisis at the border. And a lot of people know about McAllen now, and it's really weird to just sort of see that name splashed all over national news because that's my hometown. It's where I grew up. And yeah, I was born and raised there, single mom, latchkey kid. Grew up just watching TV. Parents divorced when I was pretty young.
I always like to ask about, your parents' stories. Like, what do you know of their story? How did they end up in McAllen?
Yeah. So my mom was a migrant worker with her 8 brothers and sisters. She's first generation American. And, they were working in the fields as young as 5-6 years old up until their teen years, going to school, going to Washington and California as well, migrating for work. And my dad had a similar background. Don't know too much about him, but yeah, that's my mom's history. And just to see how far she has come has certainly instilled me with a crazy work ethic because, she's been working since yay high and has really made a name for herself in South Texas. And yeah. And
I always like to also ask about grandparents. Do you know their story?
Yeah, a little bit. I know that they migrated when they were shortly married, after they were married in Mexico. I wish I remember where. But yeah, it was soon thereafter that they came into the States to find work, basically, and start a family. And that's kind of how they got the ball rolling there. And,
I'm from Chicago. I'm an immigrant. So to me, it's a very, there's no major like farming in Chicago. It's more like a blue collar immigrant town.
Yeah.
So I was just curious about, the like farm worker migrant experience. I actually don't know that much about it. And I know it's that pretty popular in the South, Texas, SoCal. So just sort of what do you know about your mom's story when she was doing that?
I mean, I remember her telling me stories all the time about picking berries. That's what I remember most, picking berries and picking apples. And that they would wake up super early in the morning, pick for a couple hours in the morning, go to school, and then pick in the afternoon. I mean, that was their day to day, which is crazy to me. I mean, I just think about that now and that it was, young children doing that, but that's the reality of it. And I, to the blue collar point that you mentioned before, I remember when they were in their teen years, my mom also worked in the canneries, in the factories and things like that on the West Coast in California and in Washington, I recall. But yeah, that was her experience.
Like you mentioned, McAllen's in the news a lot now.
Yeah.
So what was the town like growing up? I know like a border town is different. It's got sort of its own little world. So how would you describe it to someone that's never been there?
McAllen is such an interesting place because in South Texas, right there by the border, you of course have a gigantic Hispanic population. I would say that it was 95% Latino. And it is a lot of Latinos who are of course trying to assimilate to American culture. So it's this very interesting sort of blend of kind of Americana. You've got your cowboys and your pickup trucks, but it's also got a distinctly Latino and Mexican American vibe. And so there's sort of this really interesting blend of two cultures going on down there, which I always find fascinating in retrospect. When I look back at my hometown and just kind of think like where I grew up, it's small town vibe. It's definitely a growing city now. But being there right by the border, always, even when I was young, was very aware of just what that meant, the border and border patrol. And, even though we were an American family, I have vivid memories of every time we crossed the border and crossed through border patrol, just sort of a little bit of fear that was kind of instilled in me by my parents because of their experience growing up. Don't say a lick of Spanish in the presence of Border Patrol agents. Just let me speak and don't say anything. That's what I remember most about growing up in that area.
Yeah, and I like to ask about what was your home life like? What were you like as a child?
What was I like as a kid? I was definitely a latchkey kid because, again, my mom was a single mom and she was working her butt off to support us because my dad, unfortunately, just didn't really have the means to after they separated. And so being a latchkey kid, the TV was my babysitter. If I wasn't with my abuela, if I wasn't, with my tias and my cousins kind of being around them and being raised by them, I had my head directly in front of the TV. And I was just watching so many classic sitcoms, reruns. I remember watching Three's Company, Facts of Life. There was this one show, Just the 10 of Us, that I recall that was like about a white family with 8 kids. And I was like, that's a Latino family. What are you doing? What are you talking about? And so I felt like I kind of just sort of understood like, oh, I know that family. I can see myself in that family. But I never really saw myself or ourselves in those shows, of course. But I definitely feel like that was very formative for me growing up on those kind of shows.
And so I wanted to get a sense of you as a kid in, grade school, middle school, high school. Like I always ask, who were you? Who were you pretending to be? And how did people see you?
Oh, man. So growing up, I loved reading and writing. And so I feel like that also definitely sort of started me off on this journey. And had great teachers that really encouraged me to be reading and writing at that time. And I also grew up, I was a chubby kid. And so I feel like growing up overweight in South Texas, no less, like, you build that defense mechanism of, I've got to be funny. Like, I've got to make fun of myself before someone else makes fun of me. So I definitely kind of had a reputation of being the class clown. Got into trouble maybe more than a couple of times. But yeah, I was also kind of like a floater. Like I didn't really have any sort of social circle. I sort of just kind of went to everybody. And so that's what I remember most about my school experience growing up. Like I never really had one set of, social circle. I kind of just sort of gravitated to all sorts of different people. Yeah. And at this time in high school, you said you were known as the class clown. Were you like seen as a smart kid, someone that could write, I'm just curious, because sometimes people come into it later in life, and other times it's just been a natural talent they've had. Yeah, like I did well in school when I applied myself. I felt like there were definitely moments where I lacked the discipline, and I kick myself for it now in retrospect. But I, did the AP courses. I did enjoy school. Like I liked going to school and I liked having teachers that, I could tell just were there for the right reasons and really encouraged their students in the right way. Yeah. That's what I remember most about that.
And, after high school, did you sort of have a plan of what you were going to do next? Did it go according to plan?
Yeah, I always, I grew up in a Longhorn family. And so I just always had the aspiration of going to UT at Austin. I felt like I didn't even really apply many other places beyond that. And I got into UT, got into the journalism school initially because even though I knew I wanted to write and I wanted to write for film and TV, and UT has a phenomenal RTF program, as a lot of people know, I circumvented myself for whatever reason. I kind of self-sabotaged myself, as I think we often do sometimes. And so I applied for journalism instead. And after one semester of it, I was like, this is not what I want to do. Like I enjoyed it to a degree, but I was like, no, I really want to be in the film and TV space. So I sat down with my advisor after the first semester of college and we had a really long talk. And next thing I know, I got transferred into the RTF school and just kind of took it off from there.
And how did you know that, you said like part of you knew you should have gone into the film and television school. At what point growing up did you know that was something you wanted to pursue?
I always loved TV and movies growing up as a kid. Anyone in my family can tell you that. Like I was just always watching movies, always watching TV. I was obsessed. I would get dropped off all the time if my mom had to go to work or if she had to go run errands. She would drop me off at the local movie theater and I would just like spend all day there. So I just always had a love for media and I always had a love for reading and writing. So it just kind of made the most sense for me to sort of marry those two passions and try to pursue that as a career, even though it was so outsized from what normal aspirations are from that kind of area, And what were your like parents, your family's perception of like
you know, you were going to be a journalism major, then you switched over to film and television. Like how did they sort of like, were they okay with the idea? Did they even know exactly what you were sort of trying to pursue?
Yeah, I mean, my mom was always really encouraging of my dreams. So she, I think, kind of knew, like, that's where you belong, mijo. Like, what are you doing in the journalism school? Like, you belong in film and TV. Like, I've always known that's what you wanted to do. So I think she really she definitely encouraged me to make that switch.
Yeah. I think my mom's a little bit slower that way. Anytime I do something, I'm like, yeah, I did that. My mom was like, what took you so long? Of course, like,
right.
Why, like, you went the long way. But again, she's so like, go at your own pace, do your own path. And she's just like sort of watching me from afar, figure it out. But
right.
But half the time, I feel like she's saying like, yeah, of course, this is what you should have been doing for the first place.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so how would you describe sort of like the differences between the town you grew up in and then this like Austin and the college-ness of it all?
You know, I always think back that, like, you know, coming from McAllen, where again it was 90% Hispanic community, very little diversity beyond that, and so I really feel like I jumped into a melting pot for the very first time at college. I always say, where I was introduced to so much more and so much more inclusion and so much more diversity, really, at my fingertips. And so I love my college experience because of that. And it opened me up to so many other things that just were not at my disposal growing up in South Texas. You know, Austin is a very liberal college town also. And so just being sort of in that safe haven in a lot of ways, I think was very formative for me. And yeah, I love my college experience because of that.
Yeah. And like in you know, what ways did it like shape you and sort of like you personally, and then sort of like your views and how you interacted in the world?
Just getting to meet so many different people from so many different walks of life, which I think is so important to kind of diversify your life, diversify your social circle. That's what it's all about. You know, I think that's, looking back and just kind of the people that I met, the paths that I was able to cross, I'm eternally grateful for, because that just was not available to me in my hometown, you know?
Yeah. And yeah, I think that's so interesting because, you know, there's a lot of talk about like students going to college for like diversity and like seeing people from other places, but I feel like that a lot of times like relates to like a white perspective, where it's like the white kid goes to the college, meets all this sort of, but it's interesting that your sort of story, and I've heard this from a couple people, it's like, yeah, I grew up around a lot of like Latinx people, and then in college it sort of opened up my view. And I sort of wonder what the effects of that are, you know, to like, because, you know, my experience was the opposite. I feel like I grew up in a very diverse high school. You know, it was designed that way purposely. And then when I went to college, it was a very white space. So it was a lot of white kids from the suburbs. Yeah. And I was sort of there like, oh, look. Yeah. I was like, oh, okay. I'm with the brochure now, you know? Like,
yeah. Can you teach us how to make tortillas?
Yeah. So yeah, it's always interesting to me when I see people that come from a very like Latinx community, sort of grew up with that as the example of how they walk through the world. Yes. And to see the differentness of it in college.
Growing up in South Texas by the border, being in such a densely Latinx community, it's so funny because I look back on it and I'm like, well, it does almost seem like we were the white people of that area, because it's like we were the dominant culture, you know? So and I always say that it's like I didn't really identify or understand my Mexican American identity until I came out here to LA, where in this industry everyone is telling you you're Latinx, you're a Mexican American writer, that's your identity, that's the box that you check for us. Because it's like it was just sort of inherent in me that it's like, yeah, I'm Mexican American, like, of course, I'm having carne con papas every other day, like I'm eating tortillas with every meal, like that's just like, that was my experience growing up, that was my upbringing. So it's like, but it wasn't until I came out here in LA that it was like, you're Mexican American, really kind of putting that stamp on me, and me really embracing that at the same time.
Yeah, you know, because I think sort of when you're introduced to a new environment and someone like points out or makes you the other, it's interesting how it could go different ways. It could go like, you know, when you're othered, sometimes you're like, oh, I don't know, it's different, and then you feel bad about it. And then at other times you sort of like embrace something that you didn't know you could be proud of just because it was so like a given where you were growing up.
Right, exactly. It was a given where I was growing up. So it was nothing that I felt like I had to grapple with, I guess. It was just kind of understood.
And were you like aware of just like a more dominant white culture compared to like you were the dominant culture in your town.
Right.
Were you aware of like the larger like American like culture?
100%. And I think to that point, like growing up on so much TV and consuming so much media, it really hit me when there was actually a show that came out that featured people that look like us. I remember it being a big deal in my family when the George Lopez show premiered. I remember it being a huge deal in my family when Ugly Betty premiered.
Yeah.
And like seeing like my mom, who of course, would watch TV with us whenever she had the time, whenever she was home, get excited about those things. That for me was like what made all the difference and made me kind of realize and inspired me when I came out here, like, well, I want to be able to create more of that content. I want to be able to see myself more on TV, because just being able to see that reflected in the joy of my mom being able to sort of see those stories on TV, it's like, well, that's it. That's why we're doing this.
Yeah. And I think that both those shows, I feel like they sort of get forgotten now in the conversation.
They do. Yeah.
But when I saw the show, they definitely showed me like the like LA Latinos, and then Ugly Betty's a very New York, like,
right.
And it, like I like didn't relate to those just in the home life, but like the touchstones were there.
Yes.
And they looked like us, but it was always interesting to me that like, there's different sort of kinds of like Latinx people out there, different families, like,
right.
It's also like geographically just like everybody else, there's some differences.
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel like the George Lopez show, I feel like it's more of a punchline now than...
Yeah, and I remember, it was such a huge deal then, and that like Sandra Bullock was one of the executive producers, that she was the one that like really not discovered George, but like, gave him that opportunity, and her definitely being sort of a Texas girl, like it just had the blend of like sort of the perfect chemistry for me and my family. It was like, oh man, look, like someone's getting it done, like someone's out there getting it done. And you're right. It's like now it does seem like a punchline, but then it was a landmark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I always love like when I first found out that she like helped produce the show, and I was always like, oh, I didn't know like Sandra Bullock was like down. Like she's like down for the cause. Okay. Like, yeah. I heard somewhere that George Lopez said that she bought him like his first cell phone. Like,
oh wow.
Like she was really like trying to set him up for success. And I was like, okay, cool. I see you.
When I was in college, I worked at a bookstore, and she came in at the time with her boyfriend at the time, Jesse James, which is a whole other conversation. And I just remember being like, oh man, like she was in line and there were a bunch of us at the cashiers, and I was like, I've got to be the one that gets Sandra Bullock. Like I've got to be the one. I'm like rushing this woman in front of me, like trying to check out all of her stuff. And I got Sandra Bullock in front of me, and like I was too scared to say anything, but I just like wanted to thank her, like, thank you for helping with the cause.
Yeah.
Like, thank you for being down. But yeah, I've heard nothing but phenomenal things about her, and I like she's out there and she's doing it.
Yeah. Shout out to her.
Yeah. Thank you, ally. Yeah.
So I want to talk about after college. Like, I feel like I used to say this more at the beginning of the episodes, but now I'm sort of bringing it back. So what was the plan after college, and what was the reality?
The plan became the reality for me very quickly, because my last semester of college, I did a satellite school program out here. And so I was out here and I was interning, and one of my professors was the post-producer on Battlestar Galactica. And getting to know me in his class, he knew I wanted to be a writer. And shortly before I was graduating back in Texas, he reached out and said, hey, this show needs a temporary writer's assistant for the last few months of production. Our writer's assistant is moving on to another show, so we need someone to fill in the gap. So I always had the dream to just move out right after college, and having that work opportunity waiting for me made me move out. Like literally graduated Saturday, drove out with my brother Sunday, started work Monday. Like that's how quickly I had to turn around and get out here. And I stayed with family friends out in Laguna Niguel and made that like 2-hour trip to and from. And like, that's what you do. I mean,
especially like when you're young and hungry, like you're like, of course, well, once you get a little bit older and you get a little more comfortable, you're like,
right.
It's a little harder to do that. But like when you're fresh into LA, you're like, yeah, of course, I'll walk the way. Like, why not?
Right. I know. It's like now it's like, oh, wait, my new job, the commute's more than 20 minutes. Really? Oh, man. I don't know if I'm going to take it. But yeah, it's like doing that 2-hour commute day to day. Like I remember not even hating it, because I was heading into like a dream job. And I was like, this is so beyond my wildest expectations. Like I'm down to do this. Yeah.
And so like, for the people at home, can you like sort of explain what your like job was, like what did you do the first week? What were you feeling like?
Just falling in. It's like it was again toward the end of the production, and it was toward the end of the series production. So the writer's room was not essentially very active. So it wasn't like a normal writer's assistant job. I was definitely more of kind of a glorified writer's PA. So I was running scripts around the lot constantly, printing copies, doing that, like getting notes transcribed that were sort of older and needed to just sort of be filed away. But even then it was like, oh man, like I'm on the Universal lot and I'm like walking around. This is so cool. So I loved it. I loved every minute of it. And it was a cool experience.
Yeah. And so how long were you staying with your like family? And
I was there for about several weeks until, again, doing the satellite school program. I had a lot of friends that graduated from that program and also moved out here shortly after. So we all found a 6-bedroom house in Burbank. Okay. 7 of us lived there. It was like a glorified frat house, but there were some women in there too. So it was co-ed, and it was like one of the best experiences for me. It was like, this is what it's like. I feel like when you have a group of very young and hungry people out here coming out to work in the entertainment industry, like that's what you do. Mm-hmm. So that's where we rolled into. Yeah.
Yeah, so I can smell it like right now. Yeah, it's so crazy. Like I had like a similar experience when I moved out here, and I was like, like I'm saying, like now I'm like, I would never do that. Why? Like,
right? Yeah, it's like I really enjoy living alone now. I'm like, I would never do that again.
But you do what you got to do.
Exactly.
And so how did your family feel about you moving out here?
Definitely encouraged me every step of the way. My mom, again, always knew since I was young that it's like I wanted to work in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. So she pushed me out here for sure. She was very supportive, but it's so funny because it's like, even though I have found success out here and I've been very lucky, every time I go back to Texas and see my family and see my mom, she's like, you can always move back here. Like, it's not too late, and I'm like, well, no, Mom, like, I'm kind of doing pretty well out there. Like, I'm making some moves. But it's hard. I mean, it's like, we're so far away from our homes and so far away from my family. And that does strike me every once in a while. I'm very close to my family, despite them being thousands of miles away. So they're always on my mind, but they're kind of like, in many ways, the fuel that makes me just keep going out here. Like, I want to just keep working. I want to keep making them proud. Yeah.
And I also, and what are sort of the differences between, living in Texas and then coming out to LA? Like, what were some of the things that like surprised you, things you weren't ready for,
I mean, Austin, when I went to college, was my first real brush with like a big city, like with actual like, tall buildings. Like that for me was like, whoa. So coming out to LA was just like that to the nth power. Like that for me, like it took some getting used to. And I remember like initially like sort of those growing pains of like, can I do this? Is this city too big? Is this too much smog in the air? Like, I don't know if I can handle this. The traffic is crazy. But again, what I think I really loved about LA and what I embraced about it was that it was a huge melting pot, which again, just like gave me so much more different people at my fingertips to get to know, different experiences coming from different walks of life. And that is what I really liked. You just, even throughout all my jobs, getting to meet several different people. That's what I really liked about it.
Yeah. And I always like sort of, someone said it to me and now I'm just repeating it constantly, that the first 2 years you're out here are like, if you can make it those first 2 years, you're sort of like set. Yeah. So can you describe those first 2 years for me?
That's so interesting because I feel like, for me, I do feel like it took 2 years to really settle in. And now I completely call LA home. I call LA home over Texas. But yeah, after I worked on Battlestar, I did all the jobs. And I think that really prepared me for the job I'm doing now. I worked in several different facets of the industry. I was a agent's assistant, which is like, I did that brutal year. Everyone does it. And they say, if you can do that year and get out, like, you're set. And I definitely felt like I did that, that breeding ground was intense, but it was definitely worth the experience. I was a PA on a show. I was on Grey's Anatomy as a PA for a while. I worked for a network executive. I was an assistant for a network executive at a network, ABC Family, before it was Freeform. So hopping around and kind of just seeing the industry from all these different points, I think really helped me into just sort of having a full grasp of what it's like. It's like it's all about, they always say like, it's how the sausage is made. And I felt like I saw it from every angle on the assembly line.
Yeah. And if you had to give advice to anybody for those first 2 years, like, sort of what would you tell them?
don't give up.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's like if you can handle those first 2 years, you can handle anything. And I think LA is all about, it's a machine, and it chews people up and it spits them out. And I think it really tests your mettle. And if you can survive it, then you're meant to be here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you sort of mentioned that when you came out to LA, that's when you were first sort of like pointed out you're like Latinidad. So
yeah.
So I just want to know, like, what was your experience when it was first pointed out, and then sort of how has it settled in within you in the city?
Well, it's funny because I think back to a lot of my earlier writing samples and how all of my characters were white. And I realized that I did that because it's like, well, they won't get made otherwise. They won't get read otherwise. And it wasn't until people were like, but you're Latino, because people were saying Latino then before LatinX. It's like, you're Latino, you're Mexican American, why aren't you telling those stories? And it sort of woke me up to the idea of like, well, yeah, why am I not telling those stories? Like, I would love to tell those stories, but it was what kept me from telling them was just this idea I had in my head that they wouldn't get made. And I mean, it's still a struggle, of course. It's still a slow roll. But seeing the embrace of our culture and seeing the embrace of our stories, as slow as it is, has woken me up to the idea that it's like, you can't cut yourself off from those kind of things.
Yeah.
And I think being able to, in a way, I sort of am grateful that people had to remind me that I'm Mexican American, because it woke me up to the idea of like, well, those are the stories that I want to tell.
Yeah. Yeah, and like this gets said all the time, like our diversity is our strength, but that's not, I feel like that's a lot of times pointed to like people of color, but it's like if you're writing something that's true to you, it translates on the page, and also people eat that shit up. They're just like, what, this actually happened to you?
Yes,
also, like, of course,
Yeah. I mean, the first pilot that I was lucky enough to sell was a story that was very much inspired by my life, even though it was a telenovela adaptation. It was a telenovela in Colombia called La Familia en Venta, Family for Sale. And it was about a couple who sort of consciously uncoupled. They got divorced and separated, but they chose to remain living together because they had to, because of economic means. And that was very much my family story growing up. Even though my parents divorced when I was young, when I was 4, my dad came back several years later to crash on our couch because he needed it. He needed the help. Yeah. And my mom's an angel. Like, she was more than happy to help him when he needed the help. So I knew that experience, and I think having that experience is what landed me the job, and being able to tell that story and just seeing that was like my first pilot sale. That was what made me so proud. It was like that I could get that kind of landmark early in my career by being able to tell a very personal story. Yeah. And that's just kind of what it's all about.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned at the beginning that you identify as Chicano. So I just want to know what that means to you.
I think, like, I always grew up sort of realizing that my dad's family, his side sort of came from Spain, and my mom's family came from Mexico. And recently did a DNA test and realized that I had like indigenous Mexicano blood with a little bit of the Spanish and Portuguese mixed in. And growing up so close to the border, knowing that I have indigenous blood, like, that for me means Chicano, like Mexican American. But Chicano, I feel like, is the term that I always heard growing up, but never really kind of fully understood. Yeah. And now that I'm older, and now that I've really sort of embraced that identity and culture, that's what I label myself as. Yeah.
And what DNA test did you take? Because there's a couple. I want to know like what the good ones are.
I did Ancestry. Yeah, I did Ancestry.
Yeah.
There's like, I never know if it's valid or not, but it's like, I hear that 23andMe like uses your DNA and like sells it to people.
It's owned by Google.
Yeah, and that terrified me, but allegedly Ancestry doesn't do that. So I was like, okay, if I'm going to do any of these, I want to do one that's like legit.
Yeah.
And it was so fascinating to just sort of see my family's history, and like just kind of, and very much centered and originated in those South Texas and then the northern part of Mexico. Right around there is like where my family's origin was.
Yeah,
so cool. we did not stray very far.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, my sister, because I heard about the Google thing too, so I had my sister do it.
Yeah.
And she, like, it wasn't a very good test. Like, it was like 75% North, Central, South America, and then like a quarter Spain. But we already knew that because my mom's dad is from there.
Yeah.
But it was very much like, I don't know if it's just like they don't have enough data or enough people are applying.
Interesting.
But yeah, it said 75% of the whole like Western Hemisphere. Huh. And I was like, that's no information at all.
Yeah, exactly. You're not giving me much.
Yeah. So yeah, I might check out Ancestry. I really want to dig in.
Yeah. And what was cool about Ancestry is that it also shows you like the profiles and pictures of people that like closely match. And it's like, I'm not gonna lie, like when you see their faces, you're like, holy crap, we were totally related.
Yeah.
Like, and of course, when I told my mom that I took the test and I got these results, she was fascinated, and my mom was like, I want to take the test too. So I bought my mom the test kit, sent it to her house in Texas. She took it right away, sent it in, and she just like logged onto Ancestry and was like all about finding her family tree.
That's
she
funny.
was like, I'm going to find all my cousins. And I remember her sending me like screen grabs on her phone of like people's profiles. And she's like, this woman is definitely my cousin. Like, look at the face. Like, she looks exactly like me. So that was really cool. That was so cool.
Yeah, that is cool. I've heard a lot of drama from those DNA tests too, like
Yeah.
long lost siblings, and
Oh, yeah.
I have a friend who actually like her dad found like a sister that they never knew existed.
I have a project going right now, actually, that I can't talk too much about, but it is all about that. About like, you think you have this Latinx identity, and then you realize like, oh crap, like no, my father is this. Like that's like it wakes them up to like just a whole different culture and a whole different identity. And I was lucky enough to be paired with a showrunner on this that had a very similar experience. He's white, Irish. You're totally European, but like, he took a 23andMe and learned that I'm like totally spilling the tea about his family history, but he'll let me share this. But it's like, he learned that his grandfather is not his grandfather.
Yeah.
And it just like completely just like opened his eyes to like, whoa, that this is real. Like this happens to people.
Yeah. All those DNA tests are like finding serial killers and like breaking up families.
Yeah, exactly. That should be the tagline for Ancestry.
Yeah. No, because what's it called? Ava DuVernay did like the Finding Your Roots, and she didn't want to do the DNA test because she didn't want to find out if she was majority white.
Oh,
she was like, "What does that mean for me?" And like, identified it. Like, So it's like there's so much to like get into there of like identity and like what you look like and how you've grown up and.
100%. And I feel like it's so interesting to me to look back in my experience growing up as Mexican American in Texas, where it is a dominantly, there's a lot of Latinos, but they are coexisting in a space with white people. So there's that dominant white culture that's very much there as well. And so for me, that's like why I want to tell these stories now, because it's like, especially in this current administration and in this social climate, what is it like to be Mexican American, to be Latinx in Texas, rubbing shoulders with your white neighbors and friends who voted for Donald Trump and are supporting those policies? I mean, it's like, it's kind of taken that monster out of the closet in many ways. I think back to, growing up in South Texas, every year during the winter time, we had what they called winter Texans or whitebirds, which was the older senior citizens that came down. They migrated from the north, and because we had warmer temperatures, and so they would stay in our area for a couple of weeks. And I just think to myself all the time, like, I remember always loving when the winter Texans came into town, because it was just like a flock of white people. And I was like, oh my God, look at them. That's cool.
Funny.
And now I'm like, oh man, no, those are Trump voters. Like, oh man, I don't know if I would be so friendly with them anymore. Or what did they think of me?
Yeah.
It really it's really woken me up to just it's sort of, I do feel like there's sort of this simmering sort of war between two cultures in Texas that I feel like has, with this current administration, been really brought to the surface. And so just sort of exploring all of that in retrospect for me, I find has really just kind of inspired me to tell some really interesting stories.
Yeah. And that sort of like came up, this past week with the shooting in El Paso.
Yes.
How, Trump went to go visit, some of the victims. They did not want to see him.
Right. Hell yeah.
Like all the nurses were taking photos of them. They said there was like a Trump rally type of like crowd outside the hospital to go see him.
Right. And that's just, again, it's like you just a world into two very different, disparate cultures that are coexisting right there. And to me, it's like, I just find that so fascinating about Texas. And that's why for me, I feel like I've been turning my eye to Texas to tell some stories recently. And I can't wait to tell them. I mean, it's like, because that's exactly what's going on. That's exactly what's going on. You're seeing, a very divided Latinx community living among a white community, and seeing those politics full bore, like out in the open like that. It's like, I can't imagine what it's like. And every time that I go home, I try to go home at least 2 or 3 times a year. People always talk about the West Coast as a bit of a bubble, and I think there is some validity to that, even though we're a bubble that is very diverse versus other bubbles in this country. But when I go home, I realize like, oh, I'm in Trump country, because my mom lives in sort of the hill country between Austin and San Antonio. And so when I'm home, I will be surrounded by pickup trucks with Trump stickers on them, or, like even Confederate flags waving in the back. And it's like, oh, this is the real, like, this is Trump country. And it's like, God, what is my mom, who's like, a businesswoman, like working here, owning her own company, like, what is that like for her? But yeah, it's fascinating to me.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I think in the last couple of years, a lot of this has bubbled over. It was always there. Just through like such like divisiveness in our politics that like when people are on one side, they're very much on that side. So like, what does it mean to like in this town to have those two things?
And Trump as a president, I mean, his rhetoric is so divisive and so damaging and so just nakedly racist and xenophobic that when you see, people embracing that and still supporting it, it shakes you. I mean, it really does, like, it grabs you by the shoulders and shakes you into the reality of like, oh, these are my friends and neighbors, but this is what they support. This is what they're voting for. And so it's very interesting. I feel like I always hear this metaphor, but it's like, I feel like we're going up on a roller coaster and we don't know what's on that other side. When it crests, it's like, I don't know what that looks like. But we will see. Yeah.
I always like, when it comes to like Trump voters and stuff, like, I don't like, it's like, especially after the election, I wasn't upset because I thought like all Trump voters are racist. It was just like more upsetting to me that racism wasn't a deal breaker for them. Right. Yeah. And also that like, I like, we live in an age where someone can say something like that at a rally and a presidential campaign and he's not booed off the stage. Like,
I know. It's crazy. I mean, look at what's going on with these, the boycotts of Equinox and SoulCycle and, these billionaires coming out and saying like, look, I hate the racism. I love the tax cuts. And it's like, buddy, that's a package deal. Like you can't divorce the two. There are communities that are being severely affected by this. Like, my God, look at what happened in El Paso. And so it's a lot to grapple with. And I don't know if as a nation we're prepared for it. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah. Because I feel like I've known a lot of Republicans where it's like, they're Republicans because they like the tax cuts.
Right.
But that's never been an excuse for me now, hasn't been an excuse for me 10 years ago.
Right.
This has always been like the reality of it. And now it's just like more in your face.
Yeah.
Like, so now it's like, okay, you're still choosing to ignore it. Okay, cool.
Yeah, exactly. It's just an inconvenient truth that they want to gloss over. You know?
Yeah. And I think what's also interesting about like Texas and, like you were talking about like this like Latinx community with like these white community, mostly Trump voters. It's also that like, people like to harp on a lot of, white women for overwhelmingly voting, but I'm like, don't look further down that chart where it says like, where like Latinos and Latinas are voting at, like
100%. I mean, I think about that a lot. That weighs heavily on my mind. I think people really underestimate how conservative Latinx families lean. I mean, a lot, mostly because of their Catholic faith. You know, they're very much guided by that. And you want to respect it, but there's also, I mean, to be totally blunt, there is a little bit of self-loathing in Latinx communities as well. I mean, look at, again, not to keep harping on this, but the El Paso shooting, the family of the 2-month-old baby who were Trump supporters, who came, brought the baby back into the hospital for the photo op. It's just like, my God, this man's rhetoric like was a huge cause of why these parents are dead, and yet you drag this baby back for a photo op. It's the reality of it, and it's like, you want to completely respect people's beliefs and leanings, but that is like part and parcel of what's going on. You know, it's very, Latinos absolutely lean conservative in many areas.
Yeah. And, I think it's very much, they're religious and, but to me, it's always been I've always known like conservative, like Republican leaning Latinx people that were out there. I've always known that.
Yeah.
And that's always, to me, just, and I talk about this all the time on the podcast, sort of the proximity to whiteness that we have.
Yes.
Where that guy with the 2-month-old baby was like, everything Trump says about Mexicans, he's not saying that about me, though.
Right.
He's saying about them. And it's like, and just how, like, we see ourselves, as, again, like, white, like, as white, Yeah. And, sort of I've brought this on the podcast before, but my journey as an immigrant in this country very came to a head when I had to fill out the like naturalization forms, and they told me to put down as my race Caucasian. And I remember thinking, this experience hasn't felt very Caucasian.
Yeah.
You know, but it is that thing, like people fully like self-loathing and just like internalizing all this like rhetoric where it's like they see themselves as white. They lean to those policies because to them, in their mind, it's never going to affect them.
Right. I mean, I think it speaks to just the assimilation that all of us face, and sort of that we are in many ways aspiring to this dominant white culture, even though we have this Latinx identity and this Latinx background. It's like we're just a touch away from it. And I feel like, you know, there's that really unfortunate saying, as true as it is, crabs in a bucket. You know, it's like, I've got mine, you get yours, you know, and it's the reality, and it's a shame. Yeah.
I think sort of we were talking about, I feel like that has been also within us the entire time. And now it's really starting to like, because it's like, I know a lot of Latinx people who have family members who are full Trump supporters.
Yeah.
And
support his immigration policies.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's crazy.
It's really tragic, truly.
Yeah.
Especially with what's going on, that we would like condone that sort of violence against our own people.
I know.
Yeah. Fun conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
That was all brought to you by ancestry.com. I feel like we gave him a lot of promo.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll let you know once I try it. I did want to talk more about you and your writing. You know, we sort of talked about how it was something that, you know, you were sitting in front of the TV, you pursued it in college. You know, I wanted to talk about like sort of like, where did it start? Where did you like start putting pen to paper? And when was the first time that it was actually like read by someone else and even like presented to somebody else?
I was fortunate enough to have just, I think, really great and encouraging English teachers growing up in those schools who, you know, encouraged me to read and write and sort of awaken that passion in me. And that brings me to two very interesting experiences that I recalled in the past week, and especially when you sent, you know, those questions to sort of go over. Two very different experiences. I remember when I was in 7th grade, and it was a white teacher who had recently moved down to the valley from the north. And we were tasked with writing, it was a letter that we had to write to a family member, and about a really interesting topic. It was about writing a letter to your brother because your brother wanted to join the cheerleading squad. And again, think this is like mid to late 90s South Texas, and how that would be perceived as taboo at the time.
Yeah.
And I thought that was such an interest. I mean, I just embraced that assignment completely, and was like, I think this is such a fascinating thing to pose to us as middle schoolers. Like, how would you grapple with this?
Yeah.
And I mean, especially in a hyper-masculine area like Texas. So all of those themes for me, I was like, oh, this is fantastic. Like, I want to dive right in and really dig in and kind of like look at this from all different angles. We turned in the papers, and I will never forget that my paper was made a show of. And the teacher stopped everybody in the classroom, and brought out my paper. And she said, you know, I've read this paper several times, and I don't know whether to give it an A or an F.
Interesting.
And I was like, whoa. And I used vocabulary in there that I guess she thought I had no idea about. I used bigger words that she was like, whoa, what's this brown kid like using these big words?
Yeah.
So she made me define some of those words for her, as if I, you know, was a fraud, as if I, you know, couldn't write this well.
Yeah.
I remember this woman even saying, I had no idea what to do with this paper, that I even had my husband read it. And I look back at that experience, and me as a 7th grader having to stand up and defend my thesis in that way and sort of prove to her that I could write that well. And I'm like, oh man, that lady had some microaggressions.
Yeah.
And it was the weirdest experience for me. I remember even then I was like, why am I being made into an example like this? And it's like, this woman can't decide whether this is great writing or terrible writing. Like, that's what?
And to bring the class in on it.
Yeah. And to not even have this discussion with me privately after class. Like, it was a whole discussion in the classroom. And then I fast forward to having my freshman year English teacher, Mr. Trevino, who I dedicate so much of my, everything that I know now, I go back to him. Mr. Trevino was the English teacher that everyone told you once you got to high school, he's the one you want. He's the AP English teacher that everybody loves, that he's an awesome teacher. You'd be lucky to have him. And I got him. And I was like, oh, this is going to be great. And he encouraged us to write and to write and to write and to read in such a beautiful way that just, I think is what woke me up to like, this is what I want to do. And he, every morning, or it was either every morning or every Monday, he would always pose a question on the board and make us do a free writing lesson on it. And we would, the brave volunteers that wanted to go up and read their free writing lesson, like he encouraged everyone in the class to do it all the time, share their stories. And I'll never forget that there was one story that was shared by a young girl in the class at the time. Again, think like South Texas, mid to late 90s. I forget what the topic was, and I feel like it had to do with sort of just the notion of death and eternity and, you know, family and everything. And in encouraging his students to tell their stories and really kind of lay it bare, this girl, I will never forget, walked up to the podium and shared this story about her uncle who was diagnosed with AIDS and had passed away recently. And there wasn't a dry eye in the room after she spoke. And it was just like, man, that there is a teacher here that would push students to tell those kind of stories in this climate and be so real. And so again, just so encouraging. I was like, I credit so much of my love of writing to him. Like that was a phenomenal class. Just one of those classes that you look back at, and one of those teachers that you look back at and you're like, man, you were doing it right.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. You know, and you can never underestimate like what a good teacher that like encourages you and fosters, you know, you and your work can make such a difference, because I think a lot of the time, you know, your confidence comes from like others like reaffirming it in your reading, your writing, and anything. Yes. And if you have somebody that's like sees you
100%,
then you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, I like, that's why I always like, I look at those two very different examples, that there was one teacher who was just like, I don't know if this is good or not. Like, and it's like, even though I was like, I feel like I'm like, you know, you can only have so much confidence when you're a kid, but it's like, I felt like I did well on that assignment. I felt like I'm a good writer. Like I, you know, did even have to stand up and defend my thesis as publicly as I did. I was like, this is kind of nuts. Fast forward 2 years, my freshman year English teacher, who is pulling me aside almost every other writing assignment to say like, Aaron, you're a really great writer and you should be pursuing this, you know, having those private affirmations with me. I was like, what a difference. What a difference.
Yeah. And, you know, to that first teacher, you know, I've sort of had to have like a conversation with like friends of mine like that, where it was like I would have that similar experiences multiple times, just like these microaggressions where me being smart was not a given, you know, me being like this little quiet brown immigrant boy. Like I remember every time a teacher was surprised that I like knew the answer, like, and I was like, and I remember thinking like, well, why wouldn't I? But it's like those little things where it's like, if you have teachers that like really look out and like foster your talents, but then there's other teachers who like don't really think that much of you, and then are like pleasantly surprised when you like
surprised, but then also like you know you run twice as fast, you jump twice as high, and they're still incredulous. You know, like that's, to me, it was just like, it was an eye-opening experience. Like I was like, oh man, this is what life's gonna be like. And sure enough, you know?
There is a difference. You know, I like even talked to like in college, like there weren't that many Latinx people in my classes. I think, and I remember in so many of them, it was like me and this other guy, and the teacher never knew our names, but she knew the 10 white guys' names. Like she would say my name and look to see which one of us would like. Oh my gosh! And I'm just thinking like, but you know everybody else's name, like you fully do.
It's weird.
Yeah. But yeah, it's like all that stuff where it's like that doesn't happen to the white kids, like that, like that's like chips at you, and like and like just like a good teacher will like completely like make you stand up straight and like be proud of something. Another one will be like just punch you right in the gut. Right,
I know. It's a world of a difference. I always look back at those two experiences and I'm just like, what a difference.
I want to ask, like, what is something that you see that is like, do you see themes that always come up in your writing? Is there like a story you're always writing about? Like, I just want to know, curious if there's like a thread that runs through all your writing.
I do feel like I gravitate to family stories. And you know, dysfunctional families, broken families, coming of age stories, like all of that is my bread and butter. And I love just telling family stories because I feel like that's just a minefield for great creative content. So whether it's a comedy, whether it's a dramedy, whether it's a drama, I feel like that's definitely the through line for me. And now more and more in just recent years, applying, family themes to just also culture, now that like we're really embracing our culture, now that people really want to hear Latinx stories, or so they say.
Yeah. They love to say.
Yeah, exactly.
They love a piano.
That for me is like, that I feel like has just enriched my writing even more. I'm like, gosh, like now that I'm really looking back at my hometown and my home life and my upbringing by the border, I'm like, there's such rich content there. How have I not mined this sooner? So I feel like that's just made me turn a corner to just an even better perspective.
Yeah. And I want to ask about like, so what has been your experience of like trying to like be like a Latinx writer in Hollywood? The stuff you have worked on, the stuff that you're trying to get made, like I'm just really trying to like see what the reception has been, both in the work environment and also like in the industry at large.
It's still a struggle because, you are a Latinx writer, but you also don't want to be confined to that box at the same time.
Yeah.
You want to be able to tell all kinds of stories. Like, don't get me wrong. I am thrilled to be able to create Latinx content that could provide opportunities for other Latinx writers and creators. But you want to be able to tell all stories at the same time. And it's like, you look at your white counterparts who do that. They're out there selling stories about Latinx families and Latinx culture. And you're like, wait a minute, like, how come you can go in there and like sell those things? And it's like, but I'm like struggling. Like I have to run twice as fast and jump twice as high just to get it in the door. So I think about that a lot. I like tweeted something recently and like, I remember like a lot of people chimed in and were like, that's so true. That's been my experience. That it's like, every year I am being asked, like, bring us that Latinx story, bring us this Latinx family comedy, like, what do you have that's Latinx? And like, again, I'm happy to do it. But then, you've got a white executive producer, showrunner, who walks into that pitch room every year and sells a story about Kate who moved back home and she finds out that her best friend is fucking her dad. And it's like, I want to sell daddy issues. Yeah. Like, why can't I walk in and sell that sitcom? Like, no, like I've got to go and like paint the richest and most textured tapestry of my family's history and culture just to get it into the door. Yeah. And even then I'm met with incredulity of like, well, is this really what it's like? Is it really like that though? And I'm like, yes, it is, because I'm here telling you that. And so you still run into those situations where it's like, we are not viewed as the authority of our stories, even when that's what we're tasked with doing. Yeah. And that is frustrating, but it just makes me want to put my nose to the grindstone and work that much harder. For me, I am so invested in just right now, I'm all about just creating Latinx stories and Latinx content because I want to make that happen. Like, I want to see more of our faces represented on TV. I want to see more of our stories represented on TV. So I'm happy to take on that mantle and get it done. Yeah. But yeah, I want to sell daddy issues. Yeah, I would love to sell that sitcom. Who wouldn't? Yeah,
that's a good title. Yeah. I think that's definitely true. Just because, the whole reason I started this podcast is because I would listen to other writers, podcasts with other writers on it, and hear demographics of certain shows where I was like, oh, we're not even writing our own stories.
No, we're not. No.
And I was like, okay, cool. Like,
yeah. I mean, it's not a surprise to me that every year we hear, like, we want to hear authentic Latinx stories from Latinx creators that have lived it, but it is generally a white creator that gets a show about culture on the air. And, that's just a hurdle that we have to jump and clear. And it's like story of our lives, like it doesn't surprise me. It's disappointing, but I feel like just slowly changing the game, and that's what I'm here to do and help too.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's like, there are definitely varying degrees of like bringing our stories to TV film. And it's like sometimes uncomfortable to be like, well, is that the right way to do that? Like,
right.
Like, oh, okay. Like, cool, I guess. Like,
yeah.
All right. I mean, I guess we should be grateful, but like, this is it. But it's also that thing where it's like, you don't want to like talk bad or attack the show because then it's like, no, well, we tried, so I don't know what now you're complaining.
Right. And you're also like, well, I also need to get on that show. Yeah. Like, I need to be,
truly, because it's, it's very complex.
It's very complex. It's like, you want to completely support the cause, and it's like, that's awesome that those white creators are taking on Latinx stories to sell, but it's like, create some space for us too.
And that's what I have seen about some like Latinx writers rooms, to be like I feel like that is just barely the start to like, like Vida.
Yes.
How, build that room, and then it's like, can you imagine all the shows that are going to come out of that show?
100%. I mean, I just recently came off the Selena series for Netflix, which was an all Latinx room, run by Moises Zamora, who was the showrunner, and it's just like, I've never been in a more encouraging space. And I'm like, I was working with such talented people, and it was like, these are my people. Like, it was kind of like, oh my gosh, like, how have I not met all of you guys before?
Yeah.
And just a room that, of course, was free of all microaggressions. Yeah. Everybody was so encouraging and supportive of one another, and we produced some amazing content at the same time. And it's like, guys, that goes hand in hand. Like, that's not an accident, you know? So I'm so grateful for that opportunity to be in an all Latinx room, to work with those people. That was great. Yeah, it kind of opens your eyes to like, this is what it's like. And it, again, makes me think like, all of these talented writers are going to have their own show soon.
Yeah.
All of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just like, I don't know, part of it upsets me because it's like just in 2019, we're starting to like build this or plant the seeds for like, the future generations of shows that will come about it.
Right.
Yeah. Because, you hear about like the X-Files room or the Seinfeld room and all these rooms where like, oh, what? They worked on that? That's crazy.
Yeah.
So I want that for like, those shows,
Right. I mean, that's the thing is it's like, okay, where were the Latinx writers on the George Lopez show and Ugly Betty, and what shows are they creating now? Like, I don't know what those rooms were like, and I can't guess, but it's like, even then it's like stories, Latinx stories that are on right now that are from white creators. It's like, I would only hope that they have given Latinx writers parity in that room. Yeah. And it's not just that you're still using only 1, 2, or 3 out of 10. Like, give them parity. Like, you're telling their stories, they should have parity in that room.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's important.
Yeah, because there's also this talk about like diversity and inclusion, but there's also like, I feel like it's very much like, well, if it's on the poster, then we did it.
Yeah,
but it's just like, no, there's layers to this. Let's like figure it out. I mean, same thing with like, gender in the industry. Yep. Like, you could have all women on the posters, but if it's like run by all men, then it's like, partial credit, I guess.
Yeah. I know. I see that a lot sometimes when it comes to gender, especially. It's like a really like female fronted story, and then it's like, oh wait, but this was like written and directed only by dudes.
Yeah. Like, it's just like, yeah, it felt like it. Like,
yeah.
And I'm not even a woman, but still, I'm just like, this is a very male show. Like,
yeah,
but it's the same thing with like our identity that you can sort of smell it when it's like, they're trying a little hard, or like
it's a little off,
doesn't ring true, or like,
who
do they talk to? But then again, it also speaks to like the people who are greenlighting this. If someone comes in, mines their history, trauma, puts it all out there, they're like, yeah, we haven't really heard of this before. Do you have like a drug mule type show?
Right.
Like I'm sure like a border patrol show, like. Yeah. That we're familiar with. So that has to be authentic.
Exactly. Yeah. I remember one of my earlier experiences going up for a staffing job one year, and the sample that they had read was the Fox Pilot that I did about a Mexican. It was actually a Mexican and Puerto Rican family, and I will never forget what the producer told me in the meeting when he said, it was one of his first things that he said when I sat down in the interview. He said, "Weird that it was a Mexican family. Weird that it was a Latino family." And I was just like, in my mind, of course, like, what do you say to that, to someone who's the authority in the room? Yeah. It was like, well, like, why was it weird? Like, it's a family comedy. They just happened to be Mexican and Puerto Rican. Like, it still read like a family comedy. You understood the themes that were at play. But that it like was weird to him, that it brushed up against him and kind of made him even make that comment, was just like, again, to that point of like, all of my earlier samples were white family comedies or dramas, because it's like what I just assumed was the standard and what would be read and understood by the gatekeepers, to your point before. And it just like, it really woke me up to like, wow, like, is this how my stuff is being read by these white gatekeepers that like just can't exactly grapple or understand with this story because they just don't know it, and that creates this barrier that is almost impossible to cross. Tanya Siracho, who's definitely like one of my idols right now, just what she's doing in the space for Latinx people. She had an amazing Nightline interview a couple of weeks ago, and she said something that was brilliant, and it was so true. Like, we are not going to get our stories in unless the gatekeepers start looking like us. Yeah, and I think that is so important and so valid, because once people can really identify what our stories are and can understand them, instead of like being confused by them, sort of like, again, meeting them with sort of this incredulousness of like, is this really what it was like? Like, that needs to change, and I feel like it's slowly changing, but it needs to change.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about this the other day, how lucky we are that like Tanya Siracho has been the voice and the face of this.
Yes.
In this moment.
Her and Gloria Calderon Collette. Like, of course, like, Latinas are the ones getting it done.
Always.
Yeah. Like, of course they are. Like, it's no surprise to me that these are the badasses.
By that.
Yeah. But, like, growing up with a single Mexican mom, like, I'm like, of course they are. Like, yeah hell yeah.
Anywhere I'm working, anything, I'm just like, oh, you mean the women are like listening and talking and like pushing things forward? I'm like, yeah, that seems about right.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, yeah, the better like still argue to see who's in charge.
Right. Yeah, exactly. They're the ones just like leading us into the charge.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other thing that I like get so upset about, you know, with Tanya is like, I feel like not her, but like I feel like she's only on media and like and panels and stuff. It's all like diversity. It's all like the Latinx story. It's all that. Mm-hmm. But meanwhile, like two white writers can write a show for Comedy Central and then be like on the Tonight Show. Yeah, and I'm just like, well, has Tanya been on any of those shows? Like,
no,
you know, like and that's the stuff where it's like, you know, the bar set so low for some people, and then other people are just assigned a lane, and it's like, well, we'll call you if we need you for that. But,
right. It's like they can never be perceived as mainstream entertainment, regardless of how much media Latinx consume. Yeah. You know, it's like we consume so much media and are responsible for so much of that revenue and sales, and we are still not considered a mainstream audience. It blows my mind. Yeah. There's always going to be that division.
Another happy conversation.
Yeah, story for another podcast.
Yeah. I do want to ask about, you know, just for the people at home to know, like, sort of what you're working on now, like, you know, like just sort of like where you are at in the space of your career. Just, you know, because it's nice to see like the progression, the growth, where someone started, you know, because that's what also this podcast is about, to a young up and coming kid, maybe from McAllen, listening to this, like, oh, this is someone like me. Like, yeah, what's the path that I sort of can try to follow?
You know, right now I have two projects going concurrently that are Latinx stories, Latinx forward, family stories. And so for me, it's like if I was telling any kid that was back in my hometown, focus on your culture, focus on your family, tell the stories that matter to you, the stories that you know. You were always told, write what you know. And I think I spent the bulk of my earlier career not doing that. You know, again, writing stories and family comedies that were just white families. And it was like, well, why am I doing that? Yeah. You know, so being awoken to the fact that these stories need to be told and are being asked for, you know, more and more, like, hit the ground running with that. Tell the content that matters to you, that will reflect your culture and society, and that you want to tell that is important. I think that's the big takeaway.
Yeah, because I think that's definitely the work we have to do too. You know, just from like the media we consume, we can be upset that white is seen as the default, but we also have to do the work to make sure that it's not the default in the stories we're writing.
100%. I mean, for me, my biggest goal right now is just to create more Latinx content, push that door open a little bit more, and leave it open for the rest. Like, pull those people in. You know, I'm a big believer in rising tides lift all ships. Like, it's not crabs in the bucket. It never was, and it never should be. Yeah. Like, for me, it's like all about pushing that door open a little bit more and bringing people in with me.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely been changing in the past couple of years, because for so long I would listen to interviews with writers and they'd be like, I got in and the wall sealed behind me, and like, good luck. Like, it's always like, well, I got it in the way that nobody got it, nobody else, like, it's impossible to replicate my story. And it's like, okay, but you're deciding that that's the reality, that you're not like opening the door and pulling people in. I think that's what's so admirable about like Tanya, who's like purposely like trying to like pry open that door that everyone else is trying to close, and
creating that all Latinx space in her rooms, where it's like that is now going to be a breeding ground for amazing talent and creators. And it's like it's no surprise to me, and it's not a coincidence. It's like I feel like the people that have given me the most encouragement in my career and the best opportunities were Latinx creators. I mean, Moises Zamora at Selena, like, just amazing encouragement and mentorship there. Yeah. And the other executive producers there, Henry Robles, Gladys Rodriguez, Brenda Koof, like, I've never had a support system like that in a room. And it was like, I felt like I produced my best writing because of it.
Yeah. And you know, all of that is a choice, you know? Yeah. It's all the things you have to purposely decide to do. I think we all think that inclusion is, I'm in the room, so it's so that's enough, right? And it'll just naturally happen. It's like, no, you have to decide to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because you know, we say all the time, like, do the work, and it's like, well, it actually is work. Like, you have to actually do the work. Like, right. It's not just gonna happen because you know. So many times I hear feedback, like, even with how I started this podcast, it's like, well, we we say we want inclusion, so like where are they? Like it's like, well, have you done the work to make sure that it's accessible to that audience, so that those writers,
Yeah,
it's very easy to just like write an article about it or like host a panel, but like
you got to get it done.
Yeah,
you got to out there and do the work 100%.
And this is the time of the podcast where I ask, who are some of the writers that you admire? Who are the writers, heroes of yours, peers of yours, people you're like casually Instagram stalking because you're like I love what they're doing, I'm just watching you afar, please be my friend. So so who are some of those writers?
I mean, I feel like I've already kind of name checked a lot of them, because it's like Tanya Siracho, Gloria Calderon Colette, Moises Zamora, Henry Robles, Gladys Rodriguez, Brenna Koof, Lindsay Villarreal, I believe, who's on Vida.
Oh yeah,
she's from San Antonio, and it's like I don't think I've actually had the chance to meet her in person, but I'm like loving what she's doing right now.
I had her on the podcast. She's so cool.
Yeah. I listened to that podcast and I was just like, oh man, yes, like that's who I want to get to. Like and you just like also just in hearing her and seeing what she's doing, it's like that's going to be a content creator.
Oh, for sure.
Like she's going to be a showrunner. Like that girl's a superstar, and it's like again speaks to Tanya Siracho opening that door, providing that platform, providing the opportunity for people. I think is so important. And like to your point, it's like you can staff these people, but you have to provide the opportunity. You have to provide the encouragement and make sure that they rise with you.
Yeah, that's what I got from the conversation talking to Lindsay. It's like she's from that similar school where it's like, I'm here to do the work, to do my work, but also to make sure that like other people have the same opportunity that I had. Yeah. And she's so cool.
Yeah.
After that conversation, I was like, she like reminded me of like all my friends that I've known since high school, that it's like, they get it. Like,
yes. Yeah.
There's so many times when you have a conversation, it's like, I don't think they're missing the point, or like not really vibing. But with her, I was like, and I loved it because she also led the whole conversation. I was like, she's in charge. Like I'm, and I'm happy to go along the ride. So
And I don't know if it was because she's like another Latinx from San Antonio, especially, which I have a lot of family, and a lot of my family is now kind of based there out of the valley. They're not really there anymore. But just hearing her talk, I was like, yes. Like I just felt this immediate kinship. I was like, she knows exactly what she's doing, and she knows where she's from. And like, it was great. It was a great conversation.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, like she's like going to be like every, like, that's why I also wanted her to have her on, because I was like, you see the name in the credits, but who's that person behind the credits?
Yeah.
And I think that's important, that we tell each other's stories, so then we like be like, oh, that's like me, or like, oh, that person, we share the same thoughts, or like someone else out there that I can connect to, build community. And I do want to ask, where can people follow you? Your social media. Yeah,
so I dumped Facebook last year and never looked back, so I'm not there, but they can find me on Twitter. My handle is just my name, Aaron Serna, and then on Instagram, same handle. So those are my social media platforms. Just Instagram and Twitter are where I can usually be found.
Yeah, and you're one of the Twitter accounts for writers that I like, a writer Twitter account that I feel is like I feel like sometimes it, like writer Twitter, it's a snake eating its own tail.
Yes.
and yours, every time I see one of your tweets, I'm like, oh yeah, like I enjoy it, thoroughly enjoy it. It makes me laugh sometimes. You recently enjoyed some fame. Yeah. With what's it called? My cat.
Oh my God, that Meghan McCain thing was, that was the dumbest thing I've ever put on Twitter. And then, of course, that's the thing that went viral. Like, I don't even, like, I remember sitting there on my couch, like, do I Photoshop this picture of Meghan McCain on a cat's face? And I went back and forth on it for like 30 minutes, and I was like, why the hell not? And then it just blows up. Meghan McCain freaking retweets it. And, like, I will say, I have my problems with her, but I was, I acknowledged that she had a good sense of humor about it, was able to retweet it and laugh about it. Like, I was like, okay, I can respect that. Like, that's pretty cool.
No comment on my side, but
I'm like, don't make me like you even a little bit. But
and I knew it. Like, I didn't even I saw it on my timeline. I was like, the time it took to like to like even come up with the. That's why I was like, this is like a comic genius. So like the time to be like, is this something I want to do? I'm gonna do it. Photoshop it on a cat's face, put it up.
Yeah. I mean, I was like completely, truth be told, like I was completely mocking her. Like I'm not a fan, but I was not expecting it to run away from me like that. But and
I knew it hit big because I'm like on the like Crooked Media newsletter, and they had it in there at the bottom. They always have a viral tweet, and I saw it in there, and I was like, what
oh my God, I did not know that. Yeah. That's hilarious.
So I saw it in there. I was like, oh crap. Yeah. Like this actually, like I also, it's anytime like a tweet like that goes viral for like some person. I also love reading like the follow-up tweets where it's like, hit up my Venmo. Oh, I'm also working on this.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, no one's here for that. Okay. They just like this one tweet.
Yeah.
But they try to like get in on it. And I was like,
and I had like nothing to self-promote for myself, and I was like, I'm just gonna let this wave ride out. Like, and it was really kind of, I mean, I did enjoy seeing the responses from people that like were laughing their asses off and like sharing their own jokes, like jumping on it and like joking with it too. It like it brought me back to being in a writer's room. It was like someone saw a joke and they were like, I'm gonna build on it and tell something really funny. And I was like, I was laughing my ass off at a lot of those replies. Like people had some good jokes off of that image.
Yeah.
But
So I definitely recommend the Twitter.
Thank you.
I think the Instagram, we get a couple BLTs that are the sort of thirst posts that I enjoy.
Yes,
immediately I'm just like, oh, I really want a BLT right now.
Yeah. My Instagram is not so much comedy; it's mostly just me eating. But that's my brand: jokes and food.
All right. The last question that I always ask everybody is to help me title your episode. Mm-hmm. So the prompt is always a blank Latinx writer. So you can throw in multiple words in that blank. You can move them around, just whatever feels, how you identify in general as a writer, just what feels true after this conversation. I mostly use this to just, if people are scrolling through the episodes, if they see something that they identify with,
right?
They're like, oh, that's like me. Let me listen to this. It's also an incentive to like, if people see that their story hasn't been reflected, that they'll reach out, because I'm always looking for writers to interview. Mm-hmm. But so whatever, like, however you identify.
Right now, it's like kind of on my Twitter bio too, but like I want to identify myself as like a border kid. Mm-hmm. Like I am a Chicano border kid from South Texas out here telling those stories and wanting to tell more of those stories that reflect that world and reflect that environment, because right now that needs to be told. Mm-hmm. So that's probably how I would go. Yeah. And I say this, as an immigrant, I always say, like, we talk so much about immigration and we don't know anything about it. Right.
And I feel like the border is the same thing. Like, I feel like it's covered on the news so much, but I don't think anybody, like, really knows what the hell they're talking about.
100%. I mean, that's the other thing, is that we're all talking about the border on the news, but there's never a Latinx voice on that panel ever, where there's maybe just one, facing like 5 other white faces. And it's like, story of our lives.
Or like the camera's just pointing like a reporter along the wall. But I'm like, what is like... Because I recently saw this was like a Beto O'Rourke, like just showing like going into like crossing the border from El Paso and like, spending a day there and blah blah blah. I'm like, oh, this seems like they're just going to like Six Flags or Disneyland.
Right.
It's just like a very like chill. So, and that's the other thing. It's just like that's such a different view of what we have of like what the border actually looks like.
And that it has been that way for a long time. I think people really need to open up their eyes too. Like, this has been a humanitarian crisis for a very long time. Immigrants have been so poorly treated down there for so long. I mean, those detention centers, those ice boxes, they were very much in existence when I was growing up. It's like we heard horror stories about them all the time. That's why, like, in our strive to assimilate, like, it was like we had to almost wash away that Latinx identity, because it was like, God, I don't want to end up there. Like, it's like people are getting, American citizens are getting snatched up by ICE left and right. So it's like, I mean, that is our experience. It's like we are clinging on to the threads of our own Latinx identity while trying to strive to this sort of dominant white culture, this American culture. And, it creates fascinating stories and